We're back for part 2 of our backward design workshop series. So I will hand it over to you, Cynthia.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm just getting a chat box open here. So I just want to say welcome back, to everyone. And again, just feel free at any time during this session to unmute, if you have a question or put something, in the chat box. And I'm watching that, as I'm going through. So today we're going to look at, this whole idea of performance criteria and conditions. So we're continuing on what we talked about last time, and that's backward design. And I'm going to put up a slide that will just remind us, of what that looks like, and then we'll connect it, to performance criteria and conditions and what how pivotal that is and how important that is in backward design. My name is Cynthia Korpan. I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. And I also have my own company, ITeach certification in higher ed, where I offer certificates of professional development, for individuals who are teaching in post-secondary. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Lori, for the invitation, and looking forward to our conversation today. Just to let you know what's going to happen, there will be some information sharing, but then there's going to be some interactivity as far as we're going to work together on some problem solving in a way. So, let's start to go through this. So our learning outcomes for today's session is that we're going to go through and look at the different levels of learning outcomes. That is something that, is very important. And just to realize, where they sit. We're going to look at Bloom's taxonomy, and that might be something that you're familiar with. And then we're going to look at those three main components, which are performance criteria and conditions. That was in the title. And then lastly, we're going to look at how this all fits together with assessments. And we're going to look at three different kinds of assessments: diagnostic, formative, and summative. Okay, so let's begin. First, though, I want to say that, we're talking a lot about learning outcomes today, that just a little bit about nomenclature that I'll be talking about using learning outcomes, but other people, use learning objectives, learning goals, learning aims, so they're all the same, right? They're all, there can be nuances and differences, discerned between those terms, definitely. But in general, it's all about the same thing. It's all about where you want students, they're learning to be, at the end of the program, at the end of the lesson, at the end of the module, whatever that is. So just, it doesn't matter what you call them. You can call them, whatever you want or what makes sense for you and what resonates with your students, because that's who they're really, for. They're for students. They help us as instructors, but, they're for students. So this is just a reminder of our backward design model. And backward design means that we start with the end in mind. So we begin there. So the end is what the learning outcomes, where you want students to be, at the end of the course or program or lesson. After that, after you have your learning outcomes designed, then you design your assessments and how they relate, to the learning outcomes. Then after those two are done, then you design the instructional strategy. So it isn't until then that you decide how are you going to have your instruction designed to support students reaching those learning outcomes. In the background, you can see that the most important thing is student learning. That's, what informs all of this and is the focus. And then the course context, of course, all the details about the course, the level it is, the number of students, the modality of it, whether it's in person or face-to-face or blended. All of that information is very important and has to be in the background, to inform your decisions. So that's a quick overview of backward design. And if you want more information, then the first video or recording, we'll go through all of that in more detail. So looking at scope. So here's a representation of the scope of learning outcomes. So you'll see at the very, largest areas that you can have these institutional learning outcomes. Doesn't mean that your institution has them. Some do, some don't. It just really depends. But at that level, you can see they're just going to be very broad. Like, we want all our students who graduate, from Reedley College to be global citizens, or have digital literacy, et cetera. At the program level, that is where you can get a bit more detail, right? So, but again, they're quite broad. They can be, but it really looks at different areas, some really typical ones, critical thinking skills. I think almost all programs have that integrated into it somehow. But research skills, might be part of it, or numeracy skills, might be part of it. It just depends on, what the program, is. So that's at the program level. Then at the course level, we start to get more specific, more details. So I have an example here, from a climate change, course, where at the course level, students will be able to analyze case studies about the impact, on climate change. So that's more of a course level kind of learning outcome. Getting down into the module or unit level, then it gets a little bit more detail. So they're going to be able to analyze, they need to be able to investigate the scope, the impact of climate change, to be able to analyze case studies. So you see how they're connected. And then getting down to the lesson level, you can see that it gets very specific then, because you want students to identify 3 industries that currently have a negative impact on climate change, right? So that gives them then some ideas of what are, some of the negative impacts, so that they can investigate in the scope of those impacts and then analyze, case studies. So they're all connected to support each other. So we'll look at these in a little bit more detail, the scope. So you'll see here a nice, table that shows you different characteristics of these different levels of learning outcomes. And then, how specific they are, how general they are, how useful they are for teaching, and then how useful they are for learning. And as you see here, they're all at the module, unit, or lesson level. That's where they are the highest, and their specific. I always have a hard time saying that. Specificity, being specific. Their teaching utility, is highest, and their learning utility is highest at those levels. At the course level, they can be high, but not as high as when you get down to that module, unit, and lesson level, right? But they're lowest, at the institution level, right? Because they just have to be so broad. And that's where they're highest at the institution level in their being general. Okay, so that just gives you a sense of the scope, the different levels that can exist. Like I said, they don't always exist, all of these levels, for all, at all institutions or all programs or anything. But this is, basically the most common, and this may be familiar with you, the most common where you see learning outcomes more and more is at the course level. That's the most common. At the course level, those are being developed. Some are being developed at the program level, not always at the module or lesson level, but I'm going to really argue for and support, really pushing, that's a really good thing to do. And the reason being is because students love it. And if we're taking a learning-oriented, student-centered approach to our teaching, then students absolutely love learning outcomes, because I've done a lot of small group instructional feedback. I don't know if you know SGIF, it's a whole program of where, someone like myself, not the instructor, it has to be somebody neutral, goes into a course around midterm and has a whole sort of focus group session with the students. I've heard it many times there where students are going, I don't know what to concentrate on. I don't know what's important, when the instructor is teaching. So I've heard over and over from students, and also from students who especially from students who can get very anxious, have a lot of anxiety or experience anxiety as far as wanting to know where to focus their mind, and focus their attention to get ready to be assessed and all of that. Really love learning outcomes that are clear and help them just realize what they need to focus, where they need to focus. So yeah, so students love learning outcomes in all my experience. Never had anybody complain about them. The key thing is, though, is how to write learning outcomes. So there's different tools and information that exist that can help, with writing learning outcomes. So one I kind of mentioned last time is Robert Mager's Instructional Objectives. It's a book that he wrote back in 1962, where he said the ideal, he actually said instructional objective, but learning outcome has a clear description of these three components, the title. So the conditions, the learning activity or performance, and then the criteria, right? So the conditions are when and where the learner, is doing something, the activity, what the learner is doing, and then the criteria. So how well, the learner does it. So this is just a general, sort of statement here, like under certain conditions, who, the student will do what and how well. Okay, so that's sort of a general sort of framework for writing learning outcomes. And we're going to be looking at a whole bunch of examples of these. So conditions. So what is that? So that's the context in which the activity occurs. So that can be constraints, right? So it may say when, given something, or given 10 minutes, you will need to do, this, or after class, or at the end of the program, at the end of the course, right? There can be that kind of constraint. It might be instructional stimuli, when given a certain, article to read, then you will do this, right? So it might be, so it could be given question, when you were asked a question, when you were given a problem, when you were given a prompt, et cetera. So these are conditions of when this is going to happen. So anything that informs the context. So that's the first one. And I want you to pay attention to that. I have conditions as blue because we're going to be using these colors as we go through. The learning activity, the performance, is red, and that's anything the activity is doing. Here, the important piece is the active verb. Okay, so some examples. So you're going to reflect. You're going to problem solve. You're going to write. The student's going to evaluate. The student's going to organize. The student's going to measure. Anything, any kind of learning activity, active verb that the student is doing. That's what, is the performance. So we want to keep that in mind. And then the last, so a couple of ideas about writing the using verbs. So you may have heard of Bloom's taxonomy. This is a very useful tool framework to use. And I use it all the time, right? I'm thinking, okay, what do I really want, when I'm designing a lesson or a session or a course, what do I really want students to do? And I'll use Bloom's. There's many different versions online with many different examples. Here you see, the different examples at the different levels. One thing to realize about Bloom's taxonomy, that it is hierarchical in that typically students begin by learning, just naming, being able to learn a new term, a new concept, and then they may move on to be able to understand it more, and by explaining it or demonstrating it, then being able to apply it, then being able to analyze it, evaluate, and maybe create, right? So there is a hierarchy to it. However, you do not have to follow these levels. You can start students off at analyzing, right? You can start them off at applying, and then they have to go and figure out what this is. If they don't know the terms, they can go and figure it out. So you don't have to start at remember, work your way up. I'm going to, I know it's Crackwell and I'm forgetting the other author's name, did come up with a revision of Bloom's taxonomy, which was developed, I think Bloom's was developed right around the same as time as Mager, around the 60s. But they revised it, I think in the 80s, or maybe it was the 90s. And uh, they added some, they changed the names a little bit. So instead of remember, it was remembering. They added a gerund to all of it. Um, so you'll come across that too if you're looking. But again, it's very much the same. So they're very similar. So don't get too worried about which one you're using, because they both have the same and are referring to the same thing. So Bloom's taxonomy is very useful when you're writing your learning outcomes. But you have to remember that learning outcomes are not, all equal. So often, so I've done over the years, I do a lot of consultation with individuals who are writing, for courses or programs or whatever it is, and to give feedback, on what they're doing. And with the learning outcomes, often, always, it comes up that they will use understand. It's one of the most commonly used verbs, in learning outcomes. However, it's too vague, right? It's just like, how are you going to know that? So you want, and how are students going to know they actually really understand? They may say they do, but then they're not able to actually write it, or they're not actually able to apply it, right? And it's like, that's a common issue that comes up, is that a student may think, oh, no, I think I get that, but then they can't actually do it, right? So that's where you want to get into verbs that have fewer interpretations, that are more direct. And that's where Bloom's taxonomy really helps, because they are all very more direct verbs that you can use. So you don't want to use any of those on the left-hand side, so understand or know or learn, just because they're just too vague. You want to try and keep to the types that are on Bloom's, on the right, so that it's clear for students, and clear for you, because that really helps when you're assessing student work, because then it's clear exactly what's required. Okay, lastly, the third one is criteria, and we're going to identify it as green. So this can be quantitative or qualitative or both, so it might be something like, how many or how much or how quickly or how frequently, or, qualitatively, how completely or deeply, clearly, so, there's qualitative and quantitative aspects that can be used for the criteria. So that looks like this. So here we have, so each learning outcome, you want to work towards having all three. So your conditions, your learning activity or performance, and your criteria. Okay. And for these, you want to definitely, at that lesson unit module level, to make sure all these three are stated. Also, at the course level, you want to aim to have, all three. Once you get up into the program level, you may not have all of these, because it's getting might be too specific, right? There might be some, that have all three, but maybe not all of the learning outcomes at the program level, and definitely not at the institutional level. Okay, are we ready to practice a little bit? Okay. So here's an example. So from today's session, one of them was that you were accurately identify the three main components of learning outcome. So this shows you the blue, that's our condition by the end of the session, right? So that's when it's going to happen. What are you going to do is identify the main components of learning outcomes. Then the criteria is that there's three, and accurately. Okay. So that's gives you an example of what this looks like. So as we're going to go through and look on the next slides, have some practice, you're completely however you want to do this. Happy to, have you shout out or put in chat what you think are each of the components, the 3 components. Happy for you to just work on it on your own and not share, no need to share. But I'll keep an eye on chat, and if you're unmuting and want to shout it out to everybody. But totally up to you how you want to do this. But we're going to go through a few examples. So here's the first one. So given a never before seen article, you will accurately identify 3 assumptions made by the author. So first, you want to identify what's your condition. What's the conditions noted, in that. And then next, what is the performance or the learning activity? So what will students do? And you want to make sure when you identify this that you just really state just what they're doing, not how well, just what they're doing. And then the criteria then is how well, what needs to be done to make it, for you to assess it. So I will put it up. So our condition is given a never before seen article. Yes, Jennifer, exactly. And then what students are doing, they're identifying assumptions made by the author. That's the activity, right? That's what you want them to do. How well is you want it to be accurate, that they identify exactly what those, the right assumptions, and that there's 3. Right? That's how many you're asking. So we're going to do a few. Okay, here's another one. When presented with a set of 20 scores, you will correctly calculate the sample standard deviation using a non-programmable standard calculator. I'll let you sit with that one for a little bit. Think about what are your conditions? Then what is the learning activity? And then what is the criteria? Okay. Put it up. So here we have 2 sets of conditions, right? We have when presented with a set of 20 scores, but the condition is that it have to use a non-programmable standard calculator. Okay, so those are your 2 conditions. What the students are doing, they're calculating the sample standard deviation. That's what they're doing. And then it has to be done correctly. Right? So that's your criteria. And you're going to notice in all of these, and this is something that we talked about last time, is that criteria often will have your academic judgment built into it, right? You know what will be the correct way that this needs to be done. Sometimes it can be very straightforward, right? And it's just like, this is right or wrong, but usually not so many things are that, clear. Usually your academic judgment has to come into this, as well, which is a good thing. Okay, so next one. So by the end of the unit, you will list the 12 cranial nerves with the proper scientific terminology. Right. Thank you for putting in the chat. So yeah, we've had the conditions, by the end of the unit. Yeah. So what's the activity, the learning activity, the performance that students will be doing? So the learning activity is a list. Jennifer put just like list, but it is list the cranial nerves. Okay. And then that leaves our criteria as there has to be the 12, right? So that's the number. And then the proper scientific, that's okay, Jennifer, the proper scientific terminology, right? So it can't just be with the terminology, or, you want to make sure that you're specific, that is the proper scientific terminology. So students know it has to be exactly that. It has to be exactly 12 and, exactly, what they're doing. Sometimes I get pushback, from professors saying, well, if I tell them in the learning outcome exactly what they have to do, then they're all going to get, A's. And then that doesn't happen. No, no, that does not happen. It's just that you're being clear of exactly what you want them to learn. And again, remember that this is the minimum. We'll talk, I sort of reinforce this a bit, later. This is the minimum, right? So minimum means that typically that if a student attains this learning outcome, that equals a B. That's not an A. This is not listing your learning outcomes. They're not putting them that they have exceeded, what's expected, because this is what is just minimally expected. Okay, so remember that, because that can get sometimes people get muddy about that. Okay, so this one, through discussions and reflections, you will adeptly apply critical thinking skills in highlighting the relationship between two concepts presented in this course. Okay. I'll give people a second if they want to put anything in. So Lori could issue discussions and reflections. Exactly. So that's our condition, right? So through discussions and reflections, that's when it's going to happen, when students are going to be doing this. And what are they going to be doing?
Applying critical thinking skills.
Exactly. They're going to be applying critical thinking skills.
Well, it's two. Yeah, it's two, right? Because highlighting the relationship can be done without critical thinking skills.
Exactly. So they're going to apply it in highlighting the relationship between these two concepts. That's what they're going to do. And then how well? Adeptly, right? So that means with a lot of skill, right? So that's where, again, see where that adeptly, is clear enough, that it means highly skilled. But again, it allows you to have that, your academic judgment as to how well they have, how skillful they have done that. And then presented in the course is another part of our conditions, because it's they want to, yeah, that's right. So it speaks to the depth of knowledge that students, are correct. Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, you want to be here. So here, with the clarity of that, students will apply critical thinking skills and highlighting the relationship between two concepts, putting in that presented in that course. Again, just, that's part of the conditions, but it just makes it very specific. Right? So it doesn't, for students just makes, well, it can't be just between two concepts you decide on. It's about the ones, in this course. So always thinking, how can you make it specific? Writing learning outcomes is not easy. It is, I would say, probably one of the hardest things to learn. I might have brought up last time when we talked about it, when Dr. Joe Parsons first introduced, all of us, at the learning and teaching unit about learning outcomes. We were just going, it was confusing. We were just going, what? And then we're like, all these different, 3 pieces, it was like, so, and it takes a lot of practice. And a lot of times that's because it's, as the instructors, we know it so well, it's hard to really, sometimes tease out, and make that, things very specific for students. So that's part of the issue. Okay, I think we're coming up to maybe one of our last ones. So by the end of this course, you will correctly cite relevant literature to support your arguments using the most recent American Psychological Association formatting guidelines.
Sorry, I got ahead of myself there.
That's okay. That's okay.
It takes too long to type, so. The condition is by the end of the course, right?
Yeah,
And it looks like they have to use APA for
exactly. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So those are the conditions, right?
Mhm.
And then the activity.
Cite relevant literature to support your arguments.
Right. And then we have our criteria as correctly. Now, I have put that relevant, is also could be considered criteria. However, this I like to put in because to show you sometimes that, it doesn't, something may be part of the activity and you don't necessarily identify it as a criteria, but you don't have to worry about getting too worried about that. You want to just make sure you have all three, right? You want to make sure that there's definitely the activity there, your conditions are there, and there is some form of criteria, listed, right? So because I've had arguments with Joe and others, different times saying, well, no, that's really a condition. No, that's really, so you can get really, into it. So don't worry about that. It's about having the three, that makes sense.
I think ultimately that relevant helps students like know what to look for. So like in the previous one, I forget what it was that in this course, right? So they know that they don't have to go looking in other courses, just like stick to here and find those topics.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That's a good point because I teach English, and when they're writing essays, a lot of times they want to use research when really the only thing I want them to use is the article that I gave them and their personal experiences. And I think that's so interesting that there are times where I even have said just this article, that's it, that their minds want to go outside because that's what they've learned.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's why students love it, because it really helps them, just really focus on exactly what they need to do. And again, it helps you tremendously as well. Okay. So I hope that was fun. um, so, um, so related, so criteria. So setting the conditions and criteria, as I said, are very important. So we have our learning activity, and that's often the one that, we really know. We know what we want students to do. But often the conditions and criteria, might be missing or be a little bit more muddier or vague. So we want to, really think about, when we want students exactly to do this, and then how well. So this diagram nicely brings up, just our different, the three different types of assessment. So we have our diagnostic. So that's assessment before learning, but it can also be after learning a bit. I'll talk about that. We have our formative, so assessment for learning. So that's where you have practice and, oops, sorry. Practice and giving feedback. And then you have the summative, where they're actually getting a grade. So just forward, so just a bit more information here. So diagnostic can be before and after. So this is what you want to find out what students know about a topic. So that, gives you a sense of what, how well students are knowing, students that, can really contribute, support other students if it's something that they quite, know quite well. Or you find out that, everyone in the class has never heard of this concept or, this idea before. So it really is for the instructor, right? It really helps the instructor facilitate the learning by finding out, what the knowledge is. Typically, there's no grade for this. This is information for the instructor, but it could be part of participation grade. So for example, you may want to, say a diagnostic, you may want to issue at the beginning of class a short quiz about something, or a poll about something. And for you to get that information, about what students know about the concept you're teaching that day. And so that way, it may seem like it may be graded, but it isn't. It's for information, but you can make it a part of the participation grade that students need to be there They need to do it. They need to submit it, to get part of that participation grade. I said last time, and I'll state again, I'm a huge fan of participation grade. I have seen it work, myself. I use it all the time because it works really well. It just indicates to students, I don't know why my computer's doing this, jumping ahead. It really just makes students realize that how important it is to be there and to be involved, and that they are going to be acknowledged, for their involvement. Formative, is assessment for learning. So this gives students, as I said, practice and feedback. This is both student and instructor directed. It gives you information about how students are doing, gives students information about how they're doing. And again, it can be for no grade, or minimal grade. And again, it could be, part of the participation, so minimal grade means, let's say you're giving a practice quiz because a midterm is coming up, maybe the midterm is worth 20%. The practice quizzes that you give are each worth 1% or 2%, right? So it depends, so it's just minimal, but it's to give them that practice and feedback. And then, of course, we have summative, right? And that's the assessment, of student learning. And that's very often, it's also instructor directed, but it's very much, student directed and a grade assigned. So that's the whole process, different types of assessment that we want to consider as we go through with each of everything that we're doing. So this is the learning outcome that I brought up last time about the paper for anthropology, and the course learning outcome, is listed there at the top. And this is the information that I shared last time about these are the assessments and some of the instructional strategies, that I used. But I'm going to go through this in more detail. So here's the, that is the second year anthropology course. 5-page paper, double-spaced. They had to have a clear thesis statement. They had to have used 3 anthropology terms from the course. They had to use 3 anthropological resources. It had to be APA, and it was worth 15% of their final grade. Okay, so that's information about the summative assessment. So here, how that was chunked and scaffolded, and this is one of these terms, chunking and scaffolding, is that you want to think about, how to chunk a summative assessment and you break it up into chunks, and then how that needs to be scaffolded throughout a course. So how I did this one was that the first class students received the syllabus with all the assignment details in the rubric, that will be used for the summative assessment. In that class, I would use, talk about, do some diagnostic, talk about, where the writing was at, how many had, maybe written a paper before, just get a sense of where they're at. But typically, sometimes when you do a diagnostic, you're getting the responses that you're used to, right? There's after you've been teaching a course a certain amount of time, you know where students are at. But it's good to ask, because you never know. There's changes sometimes, but also it helps students realize where they're at too, and see in relation to others. So that's good information for them. On the week 3, so we get the first 2 weeks over, people dropping, people coming in, all that kind of changing that happens in the first couple of weeks. And then in week 3, I forced them to choose a topic. Just choose. We had gone through, obviously we've gone through the course, we've gone through all the topics by this time. And I just want them in week 3 to pick a topic. So commit to something, right? Don't leave it, commit to something that interests you. So they have to hand it in to me, just piece of paper, or send it over email. They just had to submit something to indicate, what they were going to do. There was no grade assigned, but it was part of the participation grade. Some people decided not to do it. Very few, most, maybe 1 or 2, out of 100 students each term, but, most just hand it in. And it didn't matter to me. I didn't do anything with them except that they got their participation grade. It was just me making them commit to something, because the next week, week 4, we had a library session. And that was an instructional strategy to, because they were required to cite 3 anthropological resources. I set up a library session with the librarian where they had to put together an annotated bibliography, so they would learn how to do that. And by forcing them to do an annotated bibliography, it meant they had to read the articles. So they had to come to the library session, they had their topic, they had to, during that, they learned what an annotated bibliography was, and they couldn't leave until they found their 3 sources. And they had myself and the librarian to help them, do that. So they walked away from that with their 3 anthropological resources, and they had to then hand in the next week their annotated bibliography, which forced them to read, and start to get to know what they're going to write about. So again, they handed in, just a part of the participation grade. I'd give them feedback. Sometimes students, maybe had to, even though they had help, they needed to look a little further, or sometimes they, just weren't happy themselves and did more research and brought in, other resources that they wanted to use, so then they would get feedback, about that. Then the next week, after they would have a week, and then they'd have to write the thesis statement. They've done some reading. They should know now, what they kind of want to write about. And they would again hand that in. Again, so this is all formative. It's all giving them practice. It's all giving them feedback. So next week, I'd give them feedback on their thesis statement, right? So that was all good. And just so one of the things I like to bring up is that, again, people, because it's 100 students, like I said, sometimes people say, well, it's too much. I can't, I'm teaching other courses. But the way I structured my classes was that some of this work, while they were doing activities in the next class, I was doing this work, while they're working on the activities. So I really tried to manage my workload, by having them do a lot of activities, because it was a very active learning classroom. So then during that class, I could also be working on giving them feedback. Then they would have a couple weeks to write their draft of their paper, and they would bring it in. Everybody would have the rubric. I'd have some guided questions, and here they would get peer feedback. So this would be something that would teach them how to read someone else's paper and how to give feedback based on the guiding questions, that I had for them. They got 3%, to do this activity, so that was part of their grade. And then the next week, they would hand in their paper with the draft. Now, one of the things that I would always have them do, and I highly recommend, and maybe some of you have done this, before they handed in the assignment, I would always have them, this would be a self-assessment. I would have them write to me, say, I would have them call me Cynthia, dear Cynthia, and have them restate their thesis statement and then tell me how well they did. I wouldn't look at those, until after I had graded it, but didn't really matter, because what I found over the years is that students were primarily really honest. They said, yeah, I don't know whether this is, the greatest. They basically would be saying to themselves, going, yeah, probably, they wouldn't say this, oh, this is a B paper, but the way they talked about it, they would be identifying it as a C paper or a B paper. I think once I had a student say, oh, this is the best paper I ever written, right? But in general, they were very honest and very self-assessed, themselves, quite honestly. So this was, then they would hand it in, and then I would, grade it, give it back to them either the next week or the week after. And this was, we would have a chance to have more learning conversations, about, anything. But over the 5 years that I taught this, 100 students each term, I never had any grade disputes because it was just very clear. It was, they, like I said, having students self-assess them, and it really helped, them there wasn't, and we were in a partnership in that way, right? It wasn't, me, giving them a grade. It was them realizing that, no, this is what I did, and and together, we realized how well they did. So that gives you an example of putting in, having your learning outcome, for the course, putting in a process of summative assessment, the criteria that you've built into your learning outcome, and then how to formulate formative assessment, throughout, to support students, to complete the assignment. And I always had, just again, there was always room on the rubric for my academic judgment on how well, they wrote, and obviously how well they, integrated the anthropological concepts and resources that they cited, and always had a really nice, range, from, A's to C's, throughout that. So just to, kind of realize, we're getting close to our time, but I want to, just provide some general guidelines and then some time for any, thoughts or questions. But just like I said at the beginning, they should be just the minimum. Your learning outcomes reflect the minimum acceptable standards, right? They're not your A pluses or your A's. They're your B's pretty well. You always want to begin. You have to have that active verb, in there. It doesn't have to be at the beginning, but that, active verb has to be there. Only one verb per learning outcome. This is something that sometimes people start to get into compound, like you're going to do this and you're going to do that. Keep them separate, right? If you don't put any ands, don't put any compounds in there, just put one active verb so it's very clear. Use simple, language, so that students, because again, this is really for students. So just make sure that's just really clear. They may not, maybe some of the language you use, they may not know yet because you're using different concepts that they're going to be taught. But that's okay. They'll get to know, that concept, as you go through the course. I have this, checklist, that just helps, just to remember, all the different things. Some of these I just, already said, but just some additions, that just remember to use, and don't use those vague verbs. You want to use really active verbs. To use Bloom's, it's a really great, resource to help, and that you may have them at the course level, but if you can build in learning outcomes into each of your lessons, it really, really helps, students, and helps them really focus, when they're trying to learn. And there's so much, information that's new that, that's where it can get very muddy for them and they don't know, it can be overwhelming. So this really helps, clarify things. And you want to make sure there's that alignment, that is there. And then summary, strong verb, Bloom's taxonomy, the 3 components, and then thinking of your diagnostic, formative, and summative assessment. So thoughts, questions, ideas. I'm going to just put up, there's references, and again, I will send this to Lori to share with all of you. And I'll stop sharing so that we can.
So just kind of thinking about this, like for one of my units where they read a book, Warriors Don't Cry, and then they have to write a theme from the book. It could be something like by the end of this unit, students will write about a theme from Warriors Don't Cry. Or do I want something more will accurately write? Or that's where I get lost. And then what about the including quotes and things like that? Like where does that go?
Okay, great question. So I'm just going to open up to the floor. What do you think? I like to do this, so you're putting out, this is what Lori's thinking. What other others think? Because if you were a learner, how would that sound to you? Would that give you enough direction? Okay, thanks, Jennifer.
What was the, can you read it one more time?
Yeah, something like by the end of this unit, students will write about a theme from the book Warriors Don't Cry. And then my question is, well, what about like the incorporating quotes? Do I want something like accurately or a um, not researched, well supported?
I think I would need more clarity in what it is you want me to write, because write is really big and broad. Is it a paragraph? Is it a paper? I don't know. Just some thoughts.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So-
And Mike has put in, yeah, needs a qualifier. Yeah. So how well?
So it would be like a 5-page essay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then how well, like that's, like that's where it's the really vague or the more specific. So a well supported.
Well, would you use the APA format?
No, I use MLA, but
Okay.
I like yeah, I mean, like for me, that's really just what the paper looks like as far as the margins and stuff. I don't want to get stuck. I mean, they need to use MLA format for quotes, but it's really about the knowledge that they have or the critical thinking of integrating quotes, of thinking about the theme and how it looks throughout the book, not just the MLA. Like I have students who say MLA format, and it's like let's move away from that and get to the content.
Well, I think in you describing to us what you're looking for, we're able to identify what's missing in your objective, because it sounds like you want to promote the students in like identifying and choosing maybe at least 2 quotes, and then like describing how that might connect. And do you want them to make personal connections or connections to like the current socio-political climate or something like that? But I think that in what you said initially, it wasn't clear that they should be looking for a quote. And at first I'd be like, well, why did it resonate with you? Like, why did you choose that quote? And in them telling us why, I feel like you're going to get answers of connection. And then there's the bulk of your paper. The MLA might not need to be in your objective. If they're already having to pick those quotes, then they'll know to list that, especially if it's in your syllabus. So I wouldn't waste like valuable qualifiers with MLA if you've already established that expectation early on in your class. But do you have a rubric? Because that might help. If you have that rubric and the rubric already says, they need to have at least 2 quotes, or, if it says the number of quotes, then they'll run with that, right? As your student, I would be like, oh, well, I'm going to pick 3 quotes. That way I can write 3 paragraphs and I can focus a paragraph on each
That's
quote.
not what I want.
It's
So,
not. Okay.
No, because when you're looking at a theme and developing a theme, it might be more than 3 quotes. It's really the topics that help develop the theme. And I try and get away from that. But what I'm thinking is like, because my essay prompt is pretty vague, like it was kind of what I gave, maybe not by the end of the unit, but maybe the essay prompt needs to be the outcome, which includes by the end of this unit, you will write, about a theme from Warriors Don't Cry, where you are incorporating multiple quotes that traces this theme from the beginning to the end of the book, or something like that. So I guess part of it is that outcome is now the essay prompt itself. Then with the other stuff like the rubric and the other MLA format, things like that. Is that kind of
Yeah. And thank you for all of that. And also what this nicely brings up is that this is an iterative process, right? This is not so you're going to find that you're going to write your say unit level, or course level, whatever it is. And then you're going to, as Gladys brought up, you're going to go, okay, so what's my assignment look like? What's my rubric look like? And then you're going to go back, you can go back and go, oh, wait, I think I want to put that, into the learning outcome too, so you're going to be going back and forth. And when you first, even, at the lesson level, that you're going to be revising these learning outcomes, right? You're probably not going to get it. Maybe some you'll get right the first time, others you will be revising for sure. So it's very much iterative, back and forth.
Yeah, no, this is good because I'm actually starting a new unit
Mm.
next week. And
Oh,
so
okay.
in the introduction of the unit, I can kind of come up with a learning outcome.
Nice.
So it sort of fits in nicely. Anyway, there's a few more minutes. Does anyone else have questions, ideas they want to ask their own outcome? I'll be
But yeah, that's great, Lori. Like, yeah, try it out, right? And see how it works, right? And see how, and never be, like, one thing we haven't talked about, and this is one of my big things too, is that you are in charge, you are in control of the type of feedback, that you attain from students. And be proactive in attaining that feedback, meaning that, Lori, do not be shy to say to students after that unit, even say, or at the end of the course, whenever you want to do it, say, listen, in unit 5 or whatever it is, there was a learning outcome, these learning outcomes. How do those learning outcomes support your learning, right, as a student, right? So get that feedback from students. You as the instructor have the authority, to ask your students these questions at any time. Your institution probably has your end of term, the student feedback that they issue, but you can ask, anytime about it. So try and get that feedback from students.
I'm super honest with my students, and I tell them, just
Nice.
like we evaluate you, you guys have the right to evaluate us, right? Like we're not perfect or and I feel like I did a good job in putting this assignment rubric or description together. But can you all look it over and then tell me what questions you might have? Did I miss something? Right? Like it humanizes me in a sense too, but
Nice.
it also helps
Yeah.
us co-create, because I'm always open to revising the prompt if more than one student is recognizing that it's not clear or they don't understand. And typically what I find is gaps in like cultural connections, right? So that maybe I have a certain expectation, I make an assumption because of my own lived experiences, and so
Yeah.
I identify the bias in that. And so then I adjust it, right? And so, oh, do we need to go over APA citations? Let me show you where you can find those resources. And then we do peer evaluations. I do use in-class time for peer evaluations, and I find those to be way more valuable because they feel more or less high stakes, right? Where some students who don't feel comfortable asking me for help can ask a peer for help, and then they inspire each other. And
yes, exactly. And they learn so much. And one of the movements is to increase students' assessment literacy, right? Instead of it being like a sort of unknown and how do professors grade and assess me, actually increasing students' assessment literacy so they actually know how to increase their ability to self-assess and peer assess, is really important. And also bringing up Gladys, I'm glad, it's great to get that feedback and make us, that's it, we're all in this together. It's not, it's a collaborative experience. One of the things that I always recommend is to really keep the focus on their learning. Like when asking questions, like say, like at the example you gave, Gladys, like what was missing that didn't support your learning, that you would need more of to support your learning, right? So that it keeps them reflecting on the fact that, they need to learn, what they need to learn.
right, absolutely. So even just giving them the purpose statement in the beginning, because I always feel like I start my presentation with like, I'm not asking you to do this just to check off a box, right?
Yeah,
Or
exactly.
just, for fun. Like the purpose of it is for you to demonstrate that you actually understood what the text covered, right? So like, tell me what you liked, but also tell me what you didn't like, or what didn't make sense. Or if you had questions, like add them. I want to know what questions you have, because if that's not clear in the text, then I'd like to elaborate on it, right?
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. Thank you for that sharing.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for being here. We have part 3 on next Friday at the same time, same Zoom link, same bat channel. And I know I learned a lot, and I hope you all have too. I know it's kind of every little thing just clarifies a little bit more
Oh, yeah.
what we
Yeah.
can do better. So
Yeah.
anyway, I hope everyone has a good afternoon, and thank you so much, Cynthia, and the rest of
Thank
your
you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
It's been lovely to see you again. Take care. Have a great week.
Yeah.